the Budweiser name is inseparable from American industry. For more than a century, it represented scale, consistency, and control. At the center of that image stood a mansion outside Street. Louis, constructed not as a personal indulgence, but as a physical expression of permanence. Grant's Farm was designed to communicate stability, success, and continuity. From the outside, it delivered exactly that. What the public did not see was how this estate functioned privately. The mansion was not simply a family home. It operated as a controlled environment where reputations were protected, conflicts were contained, and personal crises were managed out of view. Within its walls, decisions were made that shaped not only a family, but one of the most powerful corporations in American history. This documentary examines the hidden functions of the Budweiser family mansion, not rumors or folklore, but documented patterns of behavior. Patterns involving inheritance, authority, illness, secrecy, and the long-term psychological weight of legacy. The house absorbed events that would have destabilized lesser families. Suicides were ruled quietly, legal matters were resolved efficiently, internal disputes were kept behind closed doors while the public image remained intact. The mansion also served as a dividing line, between those inside the inner circle and those kept at a distance, between public generosity and private isolation, between tradition and change. Generations of the Budweiser family lived under expectations defined by the building itself. To preserve the image of success, silence was often treated as a necessity rather than a choice. By examining what occurred inside this estate, we gain insight into how extreme wealth alters accountability, how control can replace transparency, and how architecture can be used not just to impress, but to conceal. This is not a story of individual failure. It is an examination of a system that prioritized continuity over confrontation and legacy over truth. If you want to continue exploring how powerful families protect their image, preserve control, and manage collapse behind closed doors, subscribe to the channel. The mansion at Grant's Farm was built to communicate certainty. Every architectural decision reinforced permanence. Thick brick walls, symmetrical facades, formal rooms arranged for control rather than comfort. This was not a home designed for spontaneity. It was designed to endure scrutiny, to project authority, and to reassure the outside world that the family behind it was unshakable. When August Anheuser-Busch Sr. commissioned the house in the early 20th century, the Budweiser empire was at its peak. Anheuser-Busch was no longer a regional brewery. It was a national force, and its leadership understood that wealth alone was not enough. Power had to be stabilized. It had to be housed. The mansion became that container. From the beginning, the estate functioned as a boundary. It separated public access from private decision-making. Guests were welcomed selectively. Family members lived under constant awareness that their actions reflected not only on themselves but on the brand that bore their name. Privacy was not a luxury here. It was an operational requirement. The house itself reflected this mindset. Public rooms were grand but restrained, designed for hosting dignitaries, executives, and political figures without excess ornamentation. Private rooms were isolated, positioned to limit intrusion. Corridors were wide and controlled. Sound traveled intentionally. Even the placement of staircases reflected hierarchy. Servants moved unseen. Family members moved deliberately. Guests were guided. This was not accidental. The Budweiser family understood optics. They had mastered national advertising, uniform branding, and mass perception. The mansion applied those same principles to domestic life. Order on the surface, complexity underneath. What made Grant's Farm distinct from other Gilded Age estates was not extravagance, but discipline. Unlike many industrial dynasties that collapsed under indulgence, the Budweiser family emphasized regulation. Drinking was celebrated publicly, but behavior was monitored privately. Excess was tolerated only if it remained controllable. Reputation mattered more than comfort. Inside the mansion, this created a culture of silence. Problems were not discussed openly. They were addressed administratively. Health issues were managed discreetly. Conflicts were resolved through authority, not negotiation. Emotional vulnerability was treated as risk exposure. This approach worked as long as the system remained intact. For decades, the family appeared unified. Leadership transitioned smoothly from Adolphus Busch to his sons. The company expanded. The mansion hosted events that reinforced continuity. Presidents visited. Executives gathered. Traditions were repeated annually. reinforcing the illusion of stability. But silence has consequences. The first major rupture occurred not during corporate crisis, but during personal decline. August Anheuser-Busch Sr., the man who embodied discipline, began to deteriorate physically. Chronic illness confined him to the very house he had built to project strength. The mansion, once a symbol of command, became a place of isolation. His suffering was not visible to the public. Employees continued operations. Press releases emphasized recovery and resilience. Internally, however, the house became a closed environment, focused on containment. Doctors came and went. Family members adjusted routines. Staff learned to avoid certain rooms. When August Sr. ended his life inside the mansion in 1934, the response followed the established pattern. The death was explained clinically. The narrative emphasized illness. The event was contained within the estate. There was no public reckoning, no acknowledgement of psychological strain. The system absorbed the shock. This moment established a precedent. The mansion proved capable of holding tragedy without exposing it. That capability became essential as pressures increased. The Budweiser empire survived prohibition, war, and economic upheaval. But the human cost accumulated quietly behind the walls of Grant's farm. As leadership passed to August Gussie Busch Jr., the mansion's role evolved. Gussie was a different kind of figure, charismatic, expansive, publicly visible. He opened portions of the estate to the public, transforming Grant's farm into a controlled showcase. Visitors saw animals, gardens, hospitality. They did not see governance. The big house itself remained private. This duality intensified the mansion's function. Public generosity increased, private control tightened. The estate became both a symbol of accessibility and a fortress of authority. Internally, the same rules applied. Family expectations were rigid, loyalty was mandatory, disagreement carried consequences. Children grew up surrounded by privilege and pressure. Their lives unfolded under surveillance, not only by staff but by legacy. Mistakes were managed quietly. Legal issues were resolved efficiently. Accountability operated differently inside the estate. Over time, the mansion absorbed additional tragedies: accidental deaths, legal controversies, substance abuse. Each incident followed the same pattern: internal management, external silence. The public narrative remained intact. The brand endured. This was not coincidence. It was structural. Extreme wealth changes how institutions function. Consequences are delayed, redirected, or neutralized. The Budweiser mansion facilitated this by centralizing authority. Decisions were made privately by a small group. Outcomes were enforced through influence rather than transparency. The architecture reinforced compliance. Privacy discouraged disclosure. Distance discouraged dissent. Even family members learned that survival depended on discretion. Emotional expression was tolerated only within limits. By the time later generations inherited both the mansion and the company, the system was already strained. The expectations placed on heirs were immense. They were required to embody tradition while adapting to a changing world. Failure was not an option, yet guidance was limited. This tension produced instability. As scandals emerged in later decades, the mansion again served its purpose. Investigations were contained, public statements were controlled, settlements replaced trials. The physical presence of the estate symbolized continuity even as internal cohesion eroded. Eventually, the system could no longer sustain itself. Corporate control slipped away. Anheuser-Busch was sold to foreign ownership. For the first time, the mansion stood disconnected from the empire it had been built to anchor. What remained was structure without power. Grant's farm still exists. The mansion still stands. Its walls are intact. Its rooms are preserved. But its original function has changed. It is no longer a command center. It is a monument. Yet its history reveals something enduring. The Budweiser family did not hide secrets because they were uniquely flawed. They hid them because the system they built required concealment to survive. The mansion was not merely a backdrop to tragedy. It was an instrument that enabled endurance through silence. Understanding this estate means understanding how American dynasties operate behind closed doors, how control replaces conversation, how legacy overrides accountability, and how the structures designed to protect success can also trap those who live within them. The mansion at Grant's farm was built to last. It did. What it preserved, however, was not just wealth. It preserved patterns. and those patterns shaped generations long after the beer continued to flow. By the time the mansion at Grant's Farm settled into its role as the private core of the Budweiser dynasty, its most important function was no longer ceremonial. It was administrative. The house became the place where instability was absorbed and redirected, where crises were handled quietly, and where outcomes were shaped long before the public became aware that anything had gone wrong. This was most evident in how authority operated inside the estate. Leadership within the Budweiser family was never informal. It followed a strict hierarchy, reinforced by both tradition and proximity to power. The head of the family did not simply control the company. He controlled access, information, and consequence. The mansion was the physical manifestation of that control. Decisions affecting the family rarely occurred in public boardrooms. They were finalized in private rooms, behind closed doors, often without full consensus. Once made, they were presented outwardly as inevitable. This approach minimized dissent but also eliminated accountability. Within the estate, loyalty was rewarded. Resistance was isolated. Health was one of the first areas where this system asserted itself. Illness was treated as a vulnerability that needed management. Doctors were brought in discreetly. Diagnoses were shared selectively. Staff were instructed on what to say and what not to notice. Decline was hidden behind routine. Even when physical deterioration became impossible to ignore, the narrative emphasized resilience rather than limitation. This practice extended beyond physical health. Emotional and psychological strain was treated similarly. Anxiety, depression, addiction, these were not conditions to be discussed. They were problems to be neutralized. Silence functioned as policy. For younger family members, this created an environment of constant pressure. They were raised inside a structure that offered everything except emotional safety. Expectations were clear. Failure was unacceptable. Weakness was inconvenient. The mansion provided comfort but not refuge. Children learned early that privacy did not belong to them. Their lives unfolded under observation, not only by parents but by staff, relatives, and advisors whose allegiance was to the family institution rather than the individual. Mistakes were recorded, patterns were monitored. Interventions occurred quietly. When incidents happened, responses were swift and contained. Legal matters were handled through influence rather than exposure. Settlements replaced trials. Agreements replaced accountability. The mansion served as the coordinating center for these responses. Lawyers came and went. Documents were signed. Statements were prepared. The public saw none of this. Instead, the Budweiser family reinforced its image through generosity. Grant's Farm opened its gates. Animals were displayed. Beer flowed freely. The family positioned itself as benevolent, approachable, and civic-minded. This was not accidental. Public goodwill functioned as insulation. Inside the mansion, however, the cost of this strategy accumulated. Emotional distance grew between generations. Authority hardened. Communication narrowed. Family members learned that survival required compliance. As the 20th century progressed, these dynamics intensified, social norms changed, media scrutiny increased, the old methods of control became harder to sustain, but the family continued to rely on the same internal mechanisms. One of the most destabilizing forces was generational transition. Each successor inherited not only wealth but unresolved tension. They were expected to uphold tradition while navigating a world that no longer respected inherited authority in the same way. The mansion amplified this conflict. It represented permanence in a period of rapid change. For some heirs, it was a source of pride. For others, it was a burden. Substance abuse became one of the most visible symptoms of this strain. Alcohol, central to the family's business identity, was omnipresent. Drinking was normalized, even celebrated. Boundaries blurred. What began as tradition often became excess. Inside the mansion, this behavior was tolerated as long as it remained controllable. When it ceased to be manageable, the response was administrative rather than compassionate. Access was restricted. Appearances were adjusted. Public schedules were modified. Again, silence prevailed. Legal incidents followed similar patterns. Accidents involving family members were addressed through negotiation rather than litigation. Charges were reduced. Investigations stalled. Outcomes favored discretion over transparency. This did not eliminate consequences. It merely delayed them. Over time, the accumulation of unresolved grief, suppressed conflict, and insulated behavior eroded internal cohesion. Trust diminished. Rivalries emerged. Authority was questioned privately while maintained publicly. The mansion reflected this shift. Once filled with structured ceremony, it became fragmented. Some rooms went unused. Others were repurposed. The building remained intact, but its role changed. When corporate control of Anheuser-Busch was finally lost, the mansion's symbolic power collapsed. It no longer anchored an empire. It stood as a reminder of one. For many family members, this loss intensified identity confusion. The structures that had defined their lives no longer held authority. Without the company, the mansion's significance became ambiguous. Some withdrew, others acted out. The same patterns repeated without the stabilizing force of corporate dominance. Yet the estate persisted. Grant's farm continued operating. Visitors arrived, animals were cared for, traditions endured. The mansion remained closed, its history largely unexplained. This contrast between public accessibility and private opacity defines the estate's legacy. Millions have walked its grounds without understanding what the house contained. The architecture communicates nothing of the tension it absorbed. That is the final function of the mansion. Not concealment through secrecy, but concealment through normalcy. The appearance of continuity discourages inquiry. The familiar becomes unquestioned. In this way, Grant's Farm illustrates a broader truth about American dynasties. Power does not disappear when institutions collapse. It fragments, it relocates. It leaves behind structures designed to outlast scrutiny. The Budweiser family mansion was never just a home. It was a system, one that preserved success by containing failure, one that protected legacy by absorbing damage, and one that, in doing so, shaped generations in ways that cannot be measured in wealth alone. The walls still stand, the rooms remain furnished, but the silence that once protected the family now defines its history. As the 20th century advanced, the mansion at Grant's Farm entered its most paradoxical phase. Outwardly, it appeared more open than ever. The surrounding estate welcomed the public. Animals roamed fenced pastures. Beer flowed freely in designated courtyards. Families posed for photographs beneath Clydesdale arches. The Budweiser name became synonymous not only with industry, but with hospitality. Yet the mansion itself grew more sealed off, both physically and psychologically. This separation was intentional. The public-facing version of Grant's Farm was carefully curated to reflect generosity, tradition, and stability. It offered controlled access to a myth. The mansion behind it remained inaccessible, its function no longer symbolic but defensive. It existed to contain what could not be shared. By this period, the family's internal structure had become rigid. Authority was centralized, decisions flowed downward, dissent rarely moved upward. This was reinforced by generational conditioning. Children raised inside the estate learned quickly that reputation outweighed authenticity. Personal needs were secondary to institutional survival. The mansion enforced this hierarchy without words. Bedrooms were assigned by status. Movement through the house followed unspoken rules. Certain rooms were associated with power, others with service. Family gatherings followed protocol. Even moments of intimacy carried awareness of surveillance. This environment shaped behavior. Emotional restraint became a survival skill. Conflict was displaced rather than resolved. Loyalty was measured not by honesty, but by discretion. As long as the company expanded, these dynamics were tolerated. Financial success validated control. The mansion functioned as proof that the system worked, but cracks appeared as social expectations changed. Public tolerance for secrecy diminished. Media scrutiny intensified. Legal systems became less deferential to inherited power. Inside the mansion, the response was not adaptation, but reinforcement. The same methods that had worked for decades were applied with greater intensity. Information was further restricted. Decisions were made by fewer people. Isolation increased. This produced instability among younger generations. Heirs were raised with privilege but limited autonomy. They were expected to perform leadership without having participated in genuine accountability. Some internalized this pressure, others resisted through excess. Substance abuse escalated during this era. Alcohol, omnipresent and culturally sanctioned, became both refuge and liability. Within the estate, boundaries blurred. What might have triggered intervention elsewhere was normalized here. The line between indulgence and dysfunction was difficult to define when the product itself was central to identity. When incidents occurred, the response remained consistent. Problems were managed administratively. Lawyers intervened early. Settlements replaced scrutiny. Public statements were minimized or avoided altogether. The mansion coordinated these responses. Meetings took place in private rooms. Strategies were discussed behind closed doors. Outcomes were implemented quietly. The estate functioned less as a residence and more as a crisis management center. Over time, this constant containment eroded trust within the family. Relationships became transactional. Alliances shifted. Authority was obeyed but resented. Communication narrowed to necessity. The loss of corporate control marked a turning point. When Anheuser-Busch was sold, the family's primary source of unifying power disappeared. The mansion remained, but its purpose was no longer clear. For generations, the estate had justified sacrifice. Silence was acceptable because it protected the empire. With the empire gone, silence lost its rationale. What remained were unresolved grievances, fragmented identities, and a structure designed for a function it no longer served. Some family members attempted reinvention. Others withdrew. The mansion became a neutral ground for occasional gatherings rather than a center of governance. Its rooms, once associated with authority, now echoed with absence. Yet the legacy of control persisted. Patterns established over decades did not disappear with the sale of the company. They continued to shape behavior. Decisions were still made privately. Accountability remained limited. The instinct to contain rather than confront endured. This legacy extended beyond the family. The public continued to engage with Grant's Farm as a place of nostalgia and leisure. Visitors experienced continuity without context. The estate's darker history remained largely unspoken. This selective memory is not unique. It reflects a broader cultural tendency to separate success from cost. American dynasties are celebrated for what they build, not for what they suppress. The Budweiser mansion exemplifies this pattern. Its walls protected wealth, but they also insulated pain. Its structure preserved order, but discouraged healing. Its silence ensured survival, but prevented reckoning. Understanding this requires abandoning simplistic narratives. The Budweiser family was neither uniquely corrupt nor uniquely virtuous. They operated within a system that rewarded control and punished vulnerability. The mansion was both product and enforcer of that system. Today, Grant's Farm exists in a state of curated continuity. The public spaces are maintained. Traditions continue. The mansion remains private, its interior largely unchanged. It stands as a physical record of a particular model of power. What it reveals is not scandal, but mechanism. How wealth creates environments where consequences are delayed. How architecture reinforces hierarchy. How silence becomes institutional policy. The mansion did not cause tragedy, but it shaped how tragedy was managed. It transformed personal crises into logistical challenges. It allowed the family to endure without confronting the human cost of endurance. This is the hidden function of the Budweiser mansion. Not concealment for its own sake, but preservation through containment. A strategy that succeeded materially while failing emotionally. As long as the building stands, it will continue to represent that contradiction. A place celebrated for generosity, built on discipline, sustained by silence. A monument not only to success, but to the structures that make success survivable for some and unbearable for others. The legacy of Grant's Farm is not written in headlines. It is embedded in routines, habits, and inherited responses. It lives in what was said and what was never allowed to be said, and it remains, quietly, inside the mansion. By the final decades of the 20th century, the mansion at Grant's Farm had become something fundamentally different from what it was originally built to be. It no longer functioned as a center of authority, nor as a symbol of future ambition. Instead, it became a vessel of accumulation. Not of wealth, which had already been secured, but of unresolved history. Every generation added weight to the structure, not through construction, but through silence. The physical space did not change much during this period. That was deliberate. Renovation was minimal, alteration was avoided. The mansion was preserved almost as it had been, as though stability could be maintained by freezing time. Furniture remained in place, portraits stayed on the walls. Rooms kept their original functions even when no longer used. The building became a museum to itself, inhabited but not evolving. This static environment mirrored the internal condition of the family. Authority still existed, but it had lost moral clarity. Leadership positions were inherited rather than earned. Respect was expected, not cultivated. Decision-making became reactive rather than visionary. The mansion reflected this stagnation. It stood intact but directionless. Family gatherings inside the house became increasingly formal. They followed ritual rather than connection. Conversations avoided substance. History was referenced selectively. Certain names were mentioned. Others were not. Events that carried emotional weight were acknowledged indirectly, if at all. This pattern extended to how tragedy was remembered. Deaths were noted, not processed. Losses were commemorated ceremonially but never examined. The mansion absorbed grief without providing resolution. Over time, this created an atmosphere of emotional suspension. Nothing fully healed, nothing fully ended. For younger family members, growing up inside this environment produced confusion. They inherited privilege without context, expectations without explanation, rules without rationale. The mansion provided structure but not guidance. Authority existed without accountability. Love existed, but was conditional. This dynamic shaped behavior. Some heirs attempted to live up to the weight of the legacy through performance. Others rejected it through excess. Neither approach addressed the underlying absence of emotional grounding. The mansion did not offer escape. It reinforced identity through repetition. As public scrutiny intensified in the late 20th century, the family's traditional methods of containment were increasingly tested. Media coverage became less deferential. Legal outcomes were questioned. Public tolerance for opaque power diminished. The mansion, once effective at shielding internal affairs, became less capable of controlling external narratives. Internally, the response remained the same. Tighten control, limit access, avoid explanation. These strategies delayed reckoning but did not prevent it. The gap between public perception and private reality widened. This was especially evident during moments of scandal involving younger generations. Incidents that would have defined other families were minimized here. Legal consequences were negotiated. Public statements were avoided. The mansion coordinated responses behind closed doors, as it always had. But the emotional cost of these strategies accumulated. Relationships between parents and children deteriorated, trust eroded, the sense of shared purpose that once justified sacrifice disappeared. The mansion, once a unifying force, became a reminder of constraint. By the time corporate control of Anheuser-Busch was lost, the family's internal cohesion had already weakened. The sale of the company did not cause fragmentation, it revealed it. Without the business to anchor identity, the mansion stood exposed as a structure built for a role it could no longer perform. Some family members attempted to redefine Grant's Farm as heritage rather than headquarters. Others resisted change, clinging to tradition as identity. The mansion became contested ground. Not legally, but symbolically. What did it represent now? A legacy? A burden? A reminder of loss? The answer varied by generation. For older members, the mansion remained sacred. It represented survival. It justified decades of sacrifice. For younger members, it was ambiguous. It carried expectations they had not chosen. It demanded loyalty to a system they had not designed. This generational divide intensified emotional distance. Conversations became guarded. Decisions were deferred. Avoidance replaced resolution. Despite this, the mansion continued to project continuity. Its exterior remained pristine. Events were hosted selectively. Photographs circulated showing tradition intact. The public-facing image endured. This persistence reveals something essential about institutional power. Structures built to endure do not disappear when their purpose ends. They linger. They impose meaning even when relevance fades. The mansion continued to shape behavior simply by existing. It dictated where people gathered, how they interacted, what was remembered and what was avoided. It enforced tradition through presence rather than policy. The silence embedded in the walls became self-perpetuating. Each generation learned not to ask certain questions, not to revisit certain events, not to challenge certain narratives. The cost of disruption was understood intuitively. This is how legacy functions when left unexamined. It becomes constraint rather than inheritance. Grant's Farm illustrates this process with unusual clarity. The estate's public accessibility contrasts sharply with the opacity of the mansion itself. Millions have walked its grounds without ever entering the space where the most consequential decisions occurred. This separation reinforces myth while preserving silence. The mansion's role as a private venue for weddings and events in later years further abstracts its history. Moments of celebration now occur in rooms shaped by tragedy. Guests experience beauty without context. The building's past remains present but unspoken. This coexistence of joy and unresolved grief defines the estate's modern identity. It is neither fully historical nor fully contemporary. It exists in suspension, much like the family history it contains. Understanding the Budweiser mansion requires recognizing that what was hidden was not merely scandal. It was vulnerability. The family concealed not because it was malicious, but because exposure threatened the system they relied upon. Silence became protection. Protection became habit. Over time, habit became identity. The mansion did not teach emotional literacy. It taught control. It did not encourage confrontation. It rewarded endurance. These values produced extraordinary success and profound cost. As the estate continues into the present, it stands as a physical reminder of this trade-off. Wealth built the walls. Discipline maintained them. Silence filled the space between. The mansion at Grant's Farm remains intact not because it solved the problems within it, but because it absorbed them. It held everything together long enough for the world outside to keep moving. What it could not do was release what it contained. That remains inside. By the time the Budweiser family entered the 21st century, the mansion at Grant's Farm had outlived every role it was originally designed to serve. It was no longer a seat of power, no longer a family home in any meaningful sense, and no longer a strategic asset tied to corporate control. What remained was something more complicated. A preserved structure carrying the psychological residue of a dynasty that had already fractured. The building still stood with authority. Its scale had not diminished. Its presence still imposed order on the land around it. But the human system that once animated it had dissolved. The mansion had become a container without a center. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It unfolded gradually, through attrition rather than collapse. Each generation removed something essential without replacing it. Authority weakened. Shared purpose eroded. Trust thinned. What remained was habit, ritual without conviction. Family members continued to gather there, but the gatherings were symbolic rather than functional. Weddings, anniversaries, ceremonial events. These occasions reinforced continuity without addressing history. The mansion hosted moments of celebration, but never reconciliation. The absence of open reckoning defined this period. Past events were acknowledged only in fragments. Some tragedies were referenced obliquely, others were excluded entirely. Silence became tradition, passed down not through instruction, but through example. This inheritance shaped identity. Younger members of the family grew up surrounded by legacy without understanding its cost. They learned what the name represented publicly, but not what it demanded privately. The mansion stood as proof of success, but offered no explanation for the suffering embedded within it. This gap produced instability. Without a coherent narrative, individuals were left to interpret legacy on their own terms. Some embraced it uncritically, others rejected it outright. Many oscillated between pride and resentment. The mansion amplified these tensions by remaining unchanged. Its permanence made personal uncertainty more visible. The loss of corporate ownership intensified this dynamic. When Anheuser-Busch passed into foreign control, the family lost not only financial authority, but narrative coherence. The story they had told themselves for generations no longer applied. The mansion remained, but the justification for its sacrifices disappeared. For decades, silence had been defended as necessary to protect the company. With the company gone, silence became indefensible. Yet it persisted. This persistence reveals how deeply institutional habits can outlast their original purpose. The family continued to manage internal matters privately, even when public exposure no longer threatened corporate survival. The reflex to contain remained stronger than the impulse to heal. Legal incidents involving later generations followed familiar patterns. Outcomes favored discretion. Consequences were negotiated. Public explanations were limited. These responses no longer protected an empire. They protected a memory of one. The mansion coordinated this preservation. Meetings still occurred there. Decisions were still finalized behind closed doors. Authority, though diminished, remained centralized. The structure enforced continuity, even as relevance faded. Over time, this produced emotional stagnation. Relationships between siblings weakened, distance replaced dialogue. The mansion, once a unifying space, became neutral territory, safe but empty. Its role shifted from governance to preservation, not preservation of wealth, but preservation of image. The estate functioned as a physical archive of what the family had been, rather than a platform for what it might become. This distinction matters. Structures built to preserve image often resist transformation. Change threatens coherence. Coherence threatens exposure. The mansion embodied this resistance. Renovation was avoided not only to maintain historical integrity, but to avoid symbolic change. Alteration would have implied acknowledgement, a recognition that something needed updating, that the past required reassessment. Instead, the house remained fixed, and with it, the family narrative. This choice had consequences. Without adaptation, legacy hardened into constraint. Younger members experienced inheritance as obligation rather than opportunity. The mansion loomed as a reminder of expectations they had not chosen and standards they could not redefine. This burden manifested in predictable ways. Risk-taking increased. Boundaries blurred. Identity formation occurred under pressure. The absence of open communication left individuals to navigate legacy alone. The mansion did not cause these outcomes, but it reinforced them. Its silence normalized avoidance. Its permanence discouraged questioning. Its authority suppressed vulnerability. Over time, the estate became less a symbol of success and more a monument to endurance. It stood not because the family thrived, but because it had survived. This distinction reframes how we understand dynastic decline. Collapse is rarely sudden. It occurs through repetition without renewal, through systems that prioritize maintenance over meaning, through structures that preserve form while hollowing function. Grant's Farm exemplifies this process. The public grounds remain lively. Visitors experience generosity, tradition, continuity. The mansion, however, remains closed, its history largely unexplored. This separation is not accidental. It reflects a broader pattern in American power structures. Public narratives emphasize access and benevolence. Private realities remain controlled. The distance between the two sustains myth. But myths decay when they are no longer supported by purpose. In recent years, the mansion's role has become increasingly ambiguous. It hosts events, but does not anchor identity. It stands, but does not lead. It preserves history, but does not interpret it. This ambiguity mirrors the family's current position. The Budweiser name endures, but without ownership. Influence remains, but without control. Legacy exists, but without direction. The mansion reflects this condition precisely. Intact, impressive, and unresolved. What it hides now is not scandal, but absence. The absence of shared vision, the absence of accountability, the absence of dialogue. Silence once served a function. It protected a growing empire. It stabilized leadership. It managed risk. Today, silence serves no purpose beyond habit. Yet breaking it would require confronting a century of avoidance. It would require acknowledging that success was built not only on innovation and discipline, but on emotional suppression and controlled consequence. That reckoning has not occurred. Instead, the mansion remains a place where history is preserved without being examined, where events are remembered selectively, where continuity substitutes for understanding. This is the final evolution of the Budweiser family mansion. Not a fortress, not a home, not a headquarters, but a repository. It holds what the family could not resolve. It contains what could not be spoken. It stands as evidence of what happens when institutions outlast introspection. The walls remain strong, the rooms remain furnished, the grounds remain immaculate, but the structure no longer directs the future, it only shelters the past. And in that role, it reveals its deepest truth. The most enduring secrets are not the ones actively hidden, but the ones no longer questioned. They remain, quietly, inside the mansion. As the years continued to pass, the mansion at Grant's Farm entered a phase that can best be described as institutional afterlife. It existed beyond usefulness, beyond authority, and beyond necessity, yet it could not be released. Its continued presence exerted influence not through action, but through inertia. The structure no longer directed decisions, but it framed them. It no longer enforced loyalty, but it reminded everyone of the cost of disloyalty. This is how legacy persists after power fades. The family no longer lived under a single leader in the way earlier generations had. Authority fragmented, Decision-making became dispersed among trusts, advisors, legal frameworks, and private agreements. Yet the mansion remained the symbolic center, the place where final consensus was implied even when it was never formally reached. Its existence suggested continuity even when none truly existed. This subtle influence shaped behavior in ways that were difficult to articulate. Family members deferred choices. Conflicts were postponed rather than resolved. Disagreements were softened until they lost urgency. The mansion encouraged delay. It suggested that time itself could solve what conversation might expose. Over decades, this avoidance reshaped family identity. Members became adept at coexistence without intimacy. They shared space without sharing understanding. The mansion provided the illusion of unity without requiring cohesion. This was especially evident during moments of transition. Deaths, marriages, inheritance adjustments, and trust negotiations all passed through the estate in some form. Documents were signed. Decisions were ratified. But emotional processing rarely followed. The house absorbed the administrative residue of change while suppressing its emotional impact. The result was generational disconnection. Children grew up hearing fragments of history without context. Names were spoken without explanation. Events were referenced without narrative. Silence filled the gaps. The mansion stood as a physical reminder that some knowledge existed but was not accessible. This ambiguity fostered myth-making. Without clear accounts, individuals constructed their own interpretations. Some romanticized the past, others feared it. Few understood it accurately. The mansion became a canvas onto which assumptions were projected. This phenomenon is common in long-standing dynasties. When history is not interpreted, it becomes symbolic rather than instructional. Lessons are inferred rather than taught. Mistakes are repeated without recognition. At Grant's Farm, this repetition was subtle but persistent. Patterns of avoidance resurfaced. Authority was exercised indirectly. Consequences remained uneven. The instinct to protect the family name over individual well-being endured, even as the broader culture shifted toward transparency, accountability, and psychological awareness. The internal culture of the family remained anchored in an earlier era. The mansion reinforced this anchoring. Its preservation signaled that change was unnecessary, that continuity was preferable to adaptation. This resistance to change did not prevent decline. It merely altered its form. Instead of public collapse, the family experienced private erosion. Influence diminished quietly. Cohesion weakened invisibly. The mansion masked this process by remaining intact. From the outside, little appeared different. Grant's Farm continued to operate. Visitors arrived, traditions were maintained. The Budweiser legacy appeared stable. Inside the mansion, however, the absence of shared purpose was increasingly apparent. The house no longer functioned as a gathering place for decision-making. It became a neutral backdrop. Events occurred there because they always had, not because the space facilitated connection. Ritual replaced relevance. This shift had psychological consequences. Without a living narrative, individuals struggled to locate themselves within the family story. Identity became reactive. Some sought validation through association with the name. Others distanced themselves entirely. The mansion amplified this tension by remaining unchanged. It offered no cues for reinterpretation. Its rooms preserved the past without commentary. Portraits gazed down without explanation. The environment suggested certainty where none existed. In this way, the mansion became emotionally disorienting. It projected authority without guidance, history without meaning, legacy without instruction. For families with shorter histories, such ambiguity might dissipate naturally. For a dynasty of this scale, it persisted. The weight of accumulated silence prevented recalibration. No one wanted to be the first to ask questions that might unravel coherence. This reluctance extended beyond family boundaries. The broader public continued to engage with the estate as a site of nostalgia and leisure. The mansion's private history remained largely unexplored. The separation between public enjoyment and private complexity remained intact. This division served both sides. Visitors experienced uncomplicated pleasure. The family avoided scrutiny. The mansion mediated the relationship between myth and reality. But mediation is not resolution. Over time, the lack of resolution manifested as fragmentation. Family members pursued separate paths. Shared projects diminished. The mansion hosted fewer gatherings of substance. Its role narrowed further. What remained was preservation for its own sake. The house was maintained because it existed. It existed because it had always existed. This circular logic defined its final stage. In this stage, the mansion functioned less as a family asset and more as a cultural artifact. It represented a moment in American history when private wealth could construct self-contained worlds insulated from consequence. Its continued existence invites reflection on that era. Grant's Farm demonstrates how architecture can outlast ideology. The values that built the mansion, control, discretion, hierarchy, are no longer culturally dominant. Yet the structure remains, enforcing those values through space, rather than policy. This creates tension between form and function. The house demands reverence, but offers no guidance. It commands attention, but resists interpretation. It stands as an answer to a question no longer being asked. For the Budweiser family, this tension defines the present. Legacy remains, but direction does not. The mansion holds history, but not identity. It preserves memory, but not meaning. Understanding this requires abandoning the expectation of dramatic endings. Dynasties rarely end with collapse. They dissolve through relevance loss. They persist structurally while fading functionally. The Budweiser mansion illustrates this precisely. It did not fall into ruin. It did not burn. It was not abandoned. It was preserved beyond necessity. In doing so, it reveals the final cost of silence. Not scandal, not exposure, but stagnation. The mansion at Grant's Farm endures as a testament to endurance itself, to the idea that survival is sufficient, that continuity is virtue, that preservation is success. Yet beneath that endurance lies unresolved history, unexamined loss, unspoken grief, patterns repeated without recognition. Those elements remain embedded in the structure. They do not announce themselves, they do not demand attention, they simply persist. And as long as the mansion stands unchanged, so too will the silence that shaped it. As Grant's Farm moved further into the modern era, the mansion's role settled into a condition that could best be described as symbolic custody. It no longer governed a family or anchored a corporation, but it still held authority over memory. The building determined what could be remembered safely and what had to remain unresolved. In that sense, its influence was quieter than before, but no less powerful. The preservation of the mansion became an act of discipline rather than nostalgia. Every effort to maintain it signaled restraint. Nothing new was added, nothing controversial was explained. The structure was allowed to speak only through its surface. This restraint was consistent with how the family had managed difficulty for generations. Problems were not dismantled. They were contained until time dulled their edges. What distinguished this period was the absence of urgency. Earlier generations hid instability to protect power. Now there was little left to protect, yet the same reflexes remained. Silence had become inherited behavior rather than strategic choice. The mansion continued to shape interactions among family members who no longer depended on one another. Meetings were cordial. Disagreements were indirect. Conversations rarely ventured into territory that might provoke reflection. The estate facilitated coexistence without intimacy. Its scale allowed distance to exist even when people were physically close. This distance was structural. Large rooms diffused tension. Long corridors discouraged confrontation. The building itself supported emotional avoidance. It offered space to withdraw rather than engage. Over time, this became the default mode of interaction. The consequences of this avoidance became most visible during moments that demanded clarity. Decisions about stewardship, inheritance arrangements, public access, and historical interpretation required consensus. Instead of resolution, compromises were layered over unresolved disagreement. The mansion absorbed these compromises without protest. This process did not produce stability. It produced inertia. Inertia, however, can appear indistinguishable from continuity. The exterior remained immaculate. The grounds were maintained. Traditions continued in reduced form. To an outside observer, the estate appeared healthy. Inside, cohesion was thin. The lack of shared narrative created a vacuum. Without an agreed understanding of the past, the mansion's meaning became individualized. Each family member related to it differently. For some, it represented pride. For others, obligation. For others still, discomfort. This fragmentation weakened the estate's symbolic authority. The mansion no longer unified identity. It merely accommodated difference without resolving it. At the same time, public interest in dynastic history increased. Audiences became more curious about the private lives of powerful families. Transparency was increasingly valued. Institutions were expected to explain themselves. Grant's Farm existed in tension with this cultural shift. The estate responded not by engaging, but by maintaining separation. Public areas remained open, private spaces remained closed. The mansion itself resisted interpretation. Its story was implied, not articulated. This resistance preserved control but forfeited relevance. As cultural narratives evolved, the mansion remained fixed. It became less a living institution and more a preserved artifact. Artifacts invite observation, not participation. They are respected, not questioned. This suited the family's instinct to avoid scrutiny, but it also froze the narrative. Without interpretation, history loses its instructive power. It becomes aesthetic rather than ethical. Visitors admire architecture without understanding consequence. Legacy becomes decoration. The mansion facilitated this transformation. Its grandeur distracted from its function. Its beauty obscured its role as a container for unresolved conflict. Inside, the emotional climate remained static. Grief, unaddressed decades earlier, still shaped behavior. Authority without accountability continued to define relationships. Silence remained the preferred response to discomfort. This persistence illustrates how systems reproduce themselves long after their original purpose has ended. The Budweiser family no longer required secrecy to protect an empire, but secrecy continued because it had become identity. Breaking that pattern would require intentional disruption. It would require acknowledging that silence had costs, that endurance had consequences, that preservation without examination produces stagnation. Such acknowledgement did not occur. Instead, the mansion continued to exist as a neutral ground. It hosted events that avoided history. It maintained surfaces that discouraged inquiry. It preserved order without offering meaning. Over time, this neutrality became its defining feature. The house no longer symbolized triumph or tragedy. It symbolized avoidance. This avoidance shaped how the family related not only to the mansion, but to one another. Emotional distance was normalized. Conflict was deferred indefinitely. Relationships were managed rather than cultivated. The result was a family structure that endured without cohesion. Members shared a name and a property, but not a narrative. This condition reflects a broader truth about inherited power. When structures are preserved without introspection, they become obstacles rather than foundations. They demand loyalty without providing direction. Grant's Farm exemplifies this transition. It began as a statement of ambition. It became a mechanism of control. It evolved into a container for unresolved history. It now exists as a monument to endurance without resolution. The mansion's continued presence invites reflection on what is lost when silence becomes tradition, not scandal or exposure, but connection, not reputation, but meaning. History, when unexamined, does not disappear. It lingers in behavior, in relationships, in patterns repeated without understanding. The mansion holds these patterns physically, even as their origins fade from memory. This is the final consequence of hiding difficulty rather than confronting it. The cost is not collapse, but stagnation. Not ruin, but emptiness. Grant's Farm remains standing. Its walls are solid, its rooms are preserved, its grounds are alive with visitors. Inside the mansion, however, the defining feature is absence. The absence of dialogue, the absence of reckoning, the absence of shared understanding. That absence is what the Budweiser family hid most effectively. Not specific events, but the opportunity to interpret them. Not facts, but meaning. As long as the mansion remains unchanged, that absence will persist. The structure will continue to hold what was never resolved, preserving silence as faithfully as it preserves brick and stone. In this way, the mansion fulfills its final function. Not as a home, not as a headquarters, but as a record of what happens when legacy outlasts reflection. It stands, quietly, containing everything that was never said. As the narrative surrounding Grant's Farm continued to thin with time, the mansion entered a phase where its greatest influence was no longer historical or emotional, but procedural. It existed as a fixed point around which decisions were made carefully, slowly, and often indirectly. Nothing urgent happened there anymore. And that absence of urgency became its defining characteristic. In earlier decades, urgency had driven concealment. Crises required swift containment. Authority had to be exercised decisively. Silence functioned as a tool. By contrast, in this later phase, silence required no justification. It had become default behavior. The mansion no longer reacted to events. It absorbed them passively. This shift altered how responsibility operated within the family. Accountability became diffused across committees, advisors, and legal frameworks. Decisions were rarely owned by individuals. Instead, they emerged through process. The mansion provided the environment for this diffusion. Its scale allowed responsibility to disperse. No single room demanded resolution. No single space enforced clarity. This procedural approach extended to how the family engaged with its own history. Discussions about interpretation, preservation, or disclosure were framed in terms of feasibility rather than truth. What could be shared safely? What might invite scrutiny? What was necessary versus optional? The underlying question, what should be understood, was rarely addressed directly. As a result, history remained curated rather than examined. Certain narratives were reinforced repeatedly. Others were omitted entirely. The mansion did not lie. It simply did not speak. This selective silence shaped how outsiders encountered the estate. Visitors experienced Grant's Farm as an institution without conflict. The public-facing narrative emphasized continuity, generosity, and tradition. The mansion's private history was neither denied nor explained. It existed in a suspended state, acknowledged only by implication. Over time, this approach insulated the family from immediate controversy but distanced them from cultural relevance. As public interest shifted toward transparency and accountability, the estate's refusal to interpret itself rendered it static. It became less a living symbol and more a fixed relic. Inside the family, this stasis produced a quiet reckoning. Without a shared narrative, identity became increasingly individual. Members related to the legacy on their own terms, often privately and inconsistently. The mansion no longer unified perspective. It merely accommodated difference. This accommodation came at a cost. Without common understanding, collaboration weakened, joint initiatives diminished. The estate's role narrowed further, becoming logistical rather than symbolic. It hosted events because it existed, not because it inspired. The emotional atmosphere within the mansion reflected this narrowing. Interactions were polite but distant. Conversations remained surface level. The weight of history discouraged depth. Everyone understood that probing too deeply risked destabilizing the fragile equilibrium. This equilibrium was not peace. It was avoidance maintained through habit. The architecture reinforced this habit. Large rooms diffused intimacy. Formal layouts discouraged spontaneity. The building's design supported ceremony, not conversation. Over time, these spatial cues shaped behavior. The mansion taught restraint without instruction. As generations passed, fewer family members held personal memories tied to the estate's formative years. Direct witnesses faded. What remained were inherited impressions, filtered through silence. The mansion preserved atmosphere, but not explanation. This generational distance further diluted meaning. The house became impressive without being instructive. Its presence commanded respect, but offered no guidance. Younger members inherited a symbol without a story. This absence of story had practical consequences. Without a coherent understanding of the past, planning for the future became reactive. Decisions focused on maintenance rather than vision. The goal was preservation, not purpose. Preservation, however, is not neutral. It prioritizes continuity over adaptation. It resists reinterpretation. The mansion embodied this resistance. Any change risked acknowledging that the past required reassessment. As a result, the estate remained intact, but increasingly disconnected from contemporary values. The world around it evolved. Expectations shifted. Institutional transparency became normative. Grant's Farm remained insulated. This insulation protected the family from scrutiny, but isolated the mansion from relevance. It became a place people visited without questioning, a backdrop for nostalgia rather than inquiry. The family's relationship to the mansion mirrored this dynamic. It was respected but not engaged, maintained but not inhabited fully. The house remained central geographically, but peripheral emotionally. This peripheral role intensified the mansion's symbolic ambiguity. It was neither burden nor refuge, neither home nor museum. It existed in between, defined by what it was no longer. Such in-between states are difficult to resolve. They resist closure, they persist through inertia. The mansion survived not because it adapted, but because no one challenged its continued existence. This endurance invites reflection on the nature of legacy itself. When does preservation become avoidance? When does respect for history prevent understanding? When does silence stop protecting and start eroding? Grant's Farm offers no direct answers. It demonstrates outcomes rather than intentions. It shows how systems designed to manage power continue operating long after power dissipates. The mansion did not demand silence. It normalized it. Over time, that normalization shaped identity more effectively than any rule or directive could. This normalization explains why the estate remains difficult to interpret publicly, not because facts are unknown, but because interpretation has never been practiced. The family preserved structure without cultivating meaning. In doing so, they created a paradox. The mansion stands as one of the most recognizable symbols of an American dynasty, yet its significance is increasingly opaque. It represents success without context, endurance without explanation. That opacity is not accidental. It is the cumulative result of generations choosing containment over confrontation. Each decision was small. Each silence seemed reasonable. Over time, they formed a system. Systems persist even when they no longer serve those within them. Grant's Farm continues to function operationally. Visitors arrive, staff maintain grounds, events are hosted. The mansion remains closed, dignified, and quiet. Inside, the defining feature is still absence. Not emptiness of space, but emptiness of dialogue. The conversations that might reinterpret the past have never occurred. The narratives that might unify the present remain undeveloped. This is the final legacy of the Budweiser family mansion. Not secrecy, but suspension. Not concealment, but deferral. The house stands as evidence of what happens when institutions prioritize survival over understanding. When continuity replaces clarity, when silence becomes inheritance, it will likely continue to stand, its walls will endure, its rooms will remain furnished, its grounds will remain active. What it will not do, unless deliberately reimagined, is speak. And that silence, more than any scandal or tragedy, is what the Budweiser family hid inside their mansion. As Grant's Farm moved deeper into the present, the mansion's significance shifted again, not through intention but through neglect of meaning. What had once been an instrument of control, and later a vessel of preservation, now existed primarily as a liability that could not be acknowledged as such. Its value was unquestioned, its purpose was undefined. This contradiction shaped every decision surrounding it. The family no longer asked what the mansion was for. They asked only how it should be maintained. This distinction mattered. Maintenance preserves structure, purpose gives direction. Without direction, the estate drifted into procedural existence, governed by caretaking rather than vision. Caretaking emphasizes risk avoidance, nothing controversial, nothing interpretive, nothing that might invite scrutiny or disagreement. The mansion's history, complex and unresolved, was treated as something to be protected from exposure rather than understood. Silence was framed as respect. Distance was framed as dignity. This reframing allowed the family to continue without confronting deeper questions. It also ensured that those questions grew heavier with time. As the broader culture became increasingly interested in examining the private histories of powerful families, Grant's Farm remained resistant. Institutions around the country began reassessing their narratives. Estates were reinterpreted. Museums contextualized wealth and labor. Archives were opened. Grant's Farm did none of this. It remained static. That stasis was not neutral. It communicated refusal without saying so. It suggested that some histories were not meant to be explored, that certain legacies were complete and closed. Inside the family, this stance created quiet tension. Not everyone agreed with it. Some saw opportunity for reinterpretation, others saw danger. These disagreements rarely surfaced openly. They were handled through delay, deferral, and compromise. The mansion facilitated this avoidance. Its permanence discouraged urgency. Its history discouraged curiosity. It stood as a reminder of what happened when issues were confronted too directly. The family had learned over generations that confrontation carried risk. This lesson shaped how younger members approached legacy. Many chose distance, physical, emotional, or symbolic. They engaged selectively. They attended events, but avoided deeper involvement. The mansion became a place they visited rather than inhabited. This distancing weakened continuity further. Traditions persisted, but participation thinned. Rituals continued, but meaning eroded. The estate functioned, but without shared investment. Over time, the mansion's role narrowed again. It became primarily a backdrop, a venue, a controlled environment for curated moments, weddings, private gatherings, ceremonial occasions, stripped of historical context. These events emphasized beauty and continuity, while suppressing complexity. Guests experienced elegance without explanation. The mansion's past remained invisible. This invisibility was effective. It preserved tranquility, it avoided controversy, but it also transformed the estate into something hollow, a structure impressive for what it hid rather than what it revealed. The psychological cost of this approach was subtle but persistent. Family members struggled to articulate what the mansion meant to them. Pride existed, but so did discomfort. Attachment existed, but so did avoidance. The estate symbolized something unresolved. This unresolved state influenced how the family understood itself. Identity became fragmented. Without a shared narrative, individuals constructed personal versions of legacy. These versions rarely aligned. The mansion no longer unified perspective. It tolerated divergence without reconciling it. Tolerance, however, is not integration. It allows difference to coexist without addressing conflict. Over time, this erodes cohesion. Grant's Farm illustrates this erosion clearly. The estate survived materially while disintegrating symbolically. It remained impressive, but it no longer inspired alignment. It commanded respect, but not loyalty. This transformation reflects a broader pattern in inherited power structures. When institutions prioritize continuity over interpretation, they preserve form while losing function. They endure without evolving. The Budweiser mansion embodies this pattern. Its architecture remains authoritative, its presence remains commanding, yet its meaning is increasingly ambiguous. This ambiguity shapes how the public perceives the estate. Visitors encounter a site of leisure and nostalgia. They are not invited to consider the conditions that produced it. The mansion's silence ensures this separation. That separation protects the family from scrutiny, but also isolates the estate from relevance. It becomes an artifact admired but not understood. Inside the mansion, the absence of interpretation is palpable. Rooms hold objects without explanation. Portraits hang without context. History exists, but it is inaccessible. This inaccessibility is not accidental. It is the result of decades of choosing preservation over dialogue. Each generation inherited not only wealth and property, but an unspoken rule: do not open what has been closed. Over time, this rule became instinct. Silence no longer felt like a choice, it felt like tradition. Breaking tradition would require reframing the mansion's purpose. It would require acknowledging that legacy is not static, that preservation without understanding is incomplete, that endurance without meaning is insufficient. Such reframing has not occurred. Instead, the mansion continues to exist as a neutralized space, safe, controlled, and quiet. Its walls protect not secrets, but avoidance. Its rooms contain not scandal, but unresolved history. This distinction is important. The Budweiser family did not hide everything. They hid interpretation. They allowed facts to exist without narrative, events to exist without examination. The result is a legacy that feels heavy but undefined, a past that influences behavior without being understood, a mansion that commands reverence without offering instruction. As long as this condition persists, the estate will remain suspended between relevance and relic. It will endure physically while fading symbolically. It will survive without evolving. Grant's Farm will continue to welcome visitors. The grounds will remain active. The name will remain recognizable. The mansion itself, however, will remain silent. And in that silence lies its final inheritance. Not the wealth it once anchored, not the power it once protected, but the accumulated weight of everything that was never confronted. That weight remains embedded in the structure, shaping interactions, decisions, and identities long after the empire that built it has passed into history. The house still stands. The doors still close. The walls still hold. What they hold is not mystery, but refusal. Refusal to reinterpret, refusal to confront, refusal to transform. And that refusal, sustained across generations, is what ultimately defines what the Budweiser family hid inside their mansion.